It's easier, someone once said, to imagine the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism.
But it's clear that where we can make systems of this complexity, cultural systems, economic systems, machines of this complexity, surely we could make a world that could first meet those needs I described that everyone should have, and then perhaps meet needs that people have only dreamed of, like the need for some autonomy and freedom. The need for that little space up there, the I part, to expand a little bit. Just a little. Just a little. Just a little.
The socialism that could engage with the yearnings and dreamings
in Miles Davis music.
An aesthetic dimension.
Radically incompatible with everyday life under capitalism.
Hey, hi there, happy listeners. This is the Acid Left podcast, and I'm here with Adam Ray Adkins, aka Dirt Son of Earth, and Terry Tapp, my co-hosts for this edition, in which we invite Matt McManus to talk with us about the dire state of things and what he calls postmodern conservatism. Matt McManus is a professor previously at Tec de Monterey and now starting at Whitman College in the US. He's actually from Canada, and he's the author of The Rise of Postmodern Conservatism by Palgrave and What is Postmodern Conservatism, co-written with various other authors, as was Myth and Mayhem, a leftist critique of Jordan Peterson, both of which are from Zero Books. So Matt, basically your first two books, one which has been written entirely by you and one which is kind of a compendium where you've had other writers co-write, aim to explain this kind of surge of the far right, and the particular form of conservatism that we're seeing with Trump, Johnson, Salvini, Bolsonaro, to name just a few. And you, in essence, argue that the right has co-opted a number of facets of precisely postmodernism, which was originally a kind of liberal to left-leaning tendency. And I want to just sum that kind of postmodern tendency up. As Francois Lyotard, the French philosopher, said, an incredulity towards meta-narratives, or basically a lack of belief in truth schemas. Can you just take us through what that really means and how the right wing have co-opted this kind of lack of belief in grand narratives of truth?
Sure. Well, first off, thanks a lot for having me, Mike. And I also wanted to say we're all mourning Michael Brooks passing today. He was a good colleague of all of us at Zero Books. And I just want to give a shout out to anybody who's missing him today or who will be missing him in the next couple of months, since he was an irreplaceable dude and we're all feeling his loss. But on the question of postmodern conservatism, I drew very broadly on what you might call a Marxist tradition that interprets postmodernism not as a kind of theoretical or philosophical tradition, but as a cultural condition consonant with neoliberal late capitalism, if you want to use the Mendelian phrase. And there are a lot of different authors in this kind of Marxist tradition. You can think about David Harvey, Frederick Jameson, or Zero Books' own Mark Fisher, who sadly passed away in 2017. And they all analyze it in very distinctive and interesting ways and reach the conclusion that you iterated just a few seconds ago, right? That one of the characteristic features of postmodernity is declining faith on the part of the demos in grand narratives. And this includes grand narratives like Christianity or universal liberalism, and of course, grand narratives like Marxism with this kind of universal dialectic of history. And the argument that I make in the book, following another Marxist, Terry Eagleton, is that many people suspected that this declining faith in grand narratives would create good cultural conditions for various forms of left-wing activism, because with declining faith in social conservative traditionalism or religiosity or universal liberalism, it would create the opportunity to kind of agitate against structural forms of oppression. And that's very true. In many cases, the condition of postmodernity has proven fruitful ground for people that agitate for LGBTQ rights, women's rights, the rights of ethnic minorities, and that's all well and good. And I fully approve of these forms of political agitation. But Eagleton's point in his book on postmodernity is that it was really over optimistic to assume that the right wouldn't be able to adapt to the condition of postmodernity in a way that proved fruitful for them as well. And one of the points that Eagleton makes is if you look at the history of conservative thought, there are many strands of conservatism that have been extraordinarily hostile to various universalistic grand narratives. And you can talk about people like Edmund Burke, you can talk about people like Michael Oakeshott, Joseph de Maistre, Robert Bork. All these are figures in my book who I talk about as theoretical prefigures for postmodernity. And the way I describe postmodern conservatism in my books is it's the kind of reactionary politics that we see in the condition of postmodernity, which draws inspiration sometimes directly from these theoretical forces, precedents, and in other cases emulates them. And what we see with postmodern conservatism is a real enemy about the kind of instability, particularly instability around shared collective identities, which has emerged in postmodernity. But the way that they respond to this is by trying to insert contingent traditionalist identities and insisting that the reason why it is that the kind of instability we're seeing right now is that these identities were once in charge and they need to be put back into their proper place. And to do that, we need to push against various forms of progressive antagonists, whether that be leftists, feminists, immigrants, so on and so forth.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. I'm just thinking, along with that, of a kind of attitude towards truth as such. So there's this kind of like rolling back of a ceding of territory and power to leftist forces and kind of non-traditional family forces and should we say non-white groups. There's also, in doing that, a kind of complete disregard for truth, and we call this like post-truthism. I mean, to what extent is that a postmodern concern, and to what extent have the right wing succeeded in co-opting that? But I'm just kind of thinking, is what Trump's doing with his total disregard for truth, or the way that is treated by the circle around him and used to their own ends, is that kind of a taking on of postmodern values, or is that something completely different?
I think so, and I'll explain why. Right, lying and dishonesty in politics has always been a feature of political life, and you can read about it in the Greek world, and Chinese philosophy talks about the debasing effects of dishonesty, so on and so forth. Right. What's distinctive about Trump is he's not really dishonest in a conventional sense. And I think Harry Frankfurt put this really well. And it's because a liar, somebody who's dishonest in a conventional sense, is aware of what the truth is, cares about it, and then willfully distorts it. And what we see with Trump is he's much closer to what Frankfurt called a bullshitter. And Frankfurt's definition of a bullshitter, and I give this a postmodern twist, is someone who isn't willfully distorting the truth. It's someone who doesn't care about the truth or falsity of statements at all. Right? To their mind, the world and the way that it operates is purely a matter of subjective opinion. Everyone's in it for themselves, and you try to spin your interpretation of the world to get as much as you possibly can out of any given situation, right? And that's a kind of distinctively postmodern ethos to take, this kind of ubiquity of a bullshit mentality towards truth. And I think you can see the real consequences of this when you see how it is that the political right has operationalized various forms of postmodern epistemic skepticism to advance reactionary causes. Probably the most overt one is skepticism towards climate change. And you see people iterate skeptical narratives about scientific truth and lead opinion and expert opinion in order to defend and maintain the power of industrial capital, right? And that's a very useful strategy for the political right to deploy, because when you say things like, why should you trust these elite scientists with their fancy degrees, especially when ultimately they're going to try to impose taxes on you, or they're going to make your life harder, that's a really resonant narrative. for a postmodern audience that's primed to be skeptical of universalistic or expert truth claims, right?
Okay, yeah. I just want to.
Or if you want another more, just even more brazen example, right? You can think about some of the rhetoric that was deployed by the Trump administration early in his term. This appeal to alternative facts, this criticism of cultural elites. Probably the most infamous example was Giuliani's claim that truth is sometimes not truth. What people were claiming happened to not coincide with the administration's interpretation of the world. There are just multiform examples that we can point to.
Yeah, I just want to come in before passing to Terry and Adam. So you say that, broadly speaking, the right have co-opted a postmodern tendency kind of against truth. But I'm just thinking to something you say in your book with Palgrave, The Rise of Postmodern Conservatism, in which you talk about liberal thinker Edmund Burke's reflections on the revolution in France in 1790, where Burke was basically skeptical of the existence of objective truth, precisely because he saw a risk of the revolution being kind of steered in a wrong direction and becoming tyrannical. So if you have like a solid political truth that needs to be worked through society, there's a risk that it then, can be used to imprison and, otherwise abuse people, which is actually what was seen during the French Revolution. So, on the other hand, what you're talking about with Trump is kind of a use of anti-truthism, or what we call post-truthism, precisely towards tyranny. So, is there not a big difference there between a liberal use of post-truthism or a general kind of skepticism about absolute truths and a right-wing one?
Absolutely. And in the book, I try to qualify my statements about Burke by saying that, in some interpretations of his thought, you can see why arguments that he might evolve to justify various forms of postmodern conservatism. But of course, that's not the case in the more liberal moments that he showcases throughout his kind of his very kind of comprehensive oeuvre. The figure that I point to as a more significant precursor to postmodern conservative, theoretical precursor, is Joseph de Maistre, who was often considered the founder of fascism, according to Isaiah Berlin. And what Joseph de Maistre argued was that universal reason and philosophy and the claims of rationalistic truth all were destructive forces. And the reason why it is that they were destructive forces is precisely because universal reason led people to think that they had it in them, particularly ordinary people, to question authority, right? Or to be critical of authority, or say that the world can be different. And this is not something that de Maistre wanted, right? He said that you're supposed to treat politics like a creed, where the person who's in charge is in charge because God or nature put them there. You're meant to obey. And to the extent that your mind has these kind of creeping thoughts that maybe the world can be different, you should recognize those as sinful at an individual level and potentially destabilizing if enough people start to buy into this way of thinking, leading to chaos, right? And this kind of de Maistrian anxiety about the effect of universalistic reason is much, much more significant when trying to interpret the rise of postmodern conservatism. Because de Maistre was very much a strategic skeptic, right? And which is the same as postmodern conservatives, right? They'll very happily criticize universalistic reason or embed themselves within postmodern skepticism if that's necessary to resist narratives or claims that don't happen to coincide with their worldview. But when it comes to very assertive and authoritarian claims about how the world should be that do coincide with their worldview, then they don't like anyone to question that in a substantive way. And this is also an important point where we should distinguish between how it is that postmodern conservatism differs from left-wing iterations of postmodern politics, right? Because people on the political left tend to embrace pluralism as a value in and of itself and tended to look to epistemic skepticism as a way of justifying greater political pluralism. Whereas for the political right, strategic epistemic skepticism is deployed to push against universalistic truth claims that don't conform to a reactionary worldview, while at the same time their own beliefs in traditionalism and authority and force are all insulated from the same kind of corrosive impact of skepticism.
Okay, good. Thank you for that.
No problem.
I just want to bring in actually Terry, if you want to come in, because I'm imagining some of this will relate to your experience on the ground in the US. If you have anything to say.
I'm wondering how people are.
Barry, I cannot hear you.
It was canceled.
Your mic's not working.
God bless.
No,
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Hold on. Yeah, I'm in an old warehouse here in New York City, and it really distorts either my reception or my transmission. But on the question that Mike had asked of you, Matt, I wonder how ideologically driven what you're calling postmodern conservatism really is. The reason that I asked that is, here in the U.S., we have Trump, and Trump, as you correctly noticed, is playing fast and free with any idea of the truth. He's not actually lying. He's really throwing out a lot of information and disinformation simultaneously, so that any sort of questioning of him by the public, or questioning of any principles that might stand behind any of his statements, is simultaneously a contradiction of the questioner. He'll say something on Monday and contradict it on Tuesday, so that any repetition will be a contradiction. And I see that, but to me, it seems like what we're thinking of as a denial of a grand narrative that came with Leotard is inherently useful to the left. And with Trump, I don't know that behind Trump is, to me, simply power. And I think the power that exists, and the ruling class power, can be used with any particular approach to the truth. And you mentioned the denial of experts, and that was prevalent in the U.S. in the early 1800s when de Tocqueville came over here, 1830s, 1840. People didn't want to take expert advice at that time. The only reason they did is because most of the people in the U.S. were farmers, and they didn't need it. They already knew, that the soil had a particular composition because of weeds, or they knew how to feed various livestock. What do you think about that? Do you think that there's really an ideology in play, or is it people like us that look for an ideology that are pulling one forth from this behavior?
Real fast before you answer that, Matt, I kind of want to piggyback on Terry there, because what I wanted to say was very related. So just to add to what Terry was saying, how much of this do you think is like an unconscious reaction to the postmodern condition as such? So just the way that truth is perceived in society, especially with the rise of digital technologies and social media, what becomes fake news and alternative facts are spread much more readily, and the populace has an inbuilt distrust of the grand meta-narratives as such.
Well, thanks for those questions. I'm actually going to break this into two parts. One concerns the question of ideology, and then I suppose the second part will concern the relationship of modernity, going back to, let's call it Tocquevillian interpretations of modernity, and now postmodernity. When it comes to the question of ideology, I think it's really important to stress that conservatism, as it stands, has never been particularly ideological in the sense of being committed to a firm set of principles that are universal and sustained through time. Some American conservatives like to think that's the case. Ben Shapiro is a good example. But that's kind of a idiosyncrasy when it comes to conservatism looked at as a global phenomenon. Conservatism is much better understood less as an ideology and more as an outlook. And there are various conservative thinkers who have understood this for quite a long time. Russell Kirk and Edmund Burke are probably the two most prominent, right? And the conservative outlook can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. But the way that I would describe it is this kind of visceral reaction against change. And in its most potent forms, most potent reactionary forms, I should say, is the sense that the world is fundamentally disordered. Only a select few in society are able to actually bring order to the world. Usually, elites, however that happens to be interpreted, and who counts as an elite, changes again depending on the conservative. And the problem is that the forces of egalitarianism are always trying to undermine the hierarchy to replace it with some kind of democratic or egalitarian system, which is ultimately just going to return the world back to the state of nature, which is chaos and violence and destruction, right? And the reason this is not ideological, again, is it changes throughout time, right? Sometimes, the forces of egalitarianism are liberals. Other times, it's communists. Other times, it's radical Democrats. Sometimes the hierarchy that needs to be maintained is a meritocratic or aristocratic hierarchy, right? As with the Maestra. Other times, it's a capitalist hierarchy. Some people in a Nietzschean vein claim that we want to get rid of aristocracy and capitalism and replace it with a much more violent hierarchy dominated by supermen, right? So it really depends on the time and the place. And so when we understand the postmodern conservative reaction against conditions of postmodernity, what it really is a sense that the destabilization and the sense of uncertainty that's characteristic of postmodernity has to be the fault of some group that's wound up where it shouldn't be, and the undermining of whatever hierarchy the postmodern conservative happens to cherish. And that's different depending on the country, right? If you look at postmodern conservatism in Hungary, they tend to interpret, the preferred hierarchy and the forces that are undermining it in a different way than postmodern conservatives in the USA. The same is true in the United Kingdom, and the same is true in Italy, so on and so forth, right? And that's because fundamentally, again, this is an outlook rather than a consistent ideology. And it's an outlook that tends to respond to the condition of postmodernity in a pretty uniform way, even if its ideological interpretation of that tends to vary significantly. On the second question of the relationship between modernity and postmodernity, I actually think this is where we need to take de Tocqueville very seriously as a critic of liberalism. And it's something that I think a lot of liberal conservatives, people like Ben Shapiro or Jonah Goldberg, don't really do very well. Because one of the things that Tocqueville pointed out that was very insightful is precisely that liberalism contained within itself the seeds for its own self-immolation in a very Marxist sense, precisely because it engendered a democratic culture where everyone felt everyone's opinion was equal, no one could make any special claim to expertise, and consequently, you would eventually see declining standards of excellence and a kind of lethargy overtake society, right? And de Tocqueville was one of the first people to make these kinds of claims. And many people have made these arguments since then. Probably the most famous is somebody like Karl Marx, who also tended to claim that the imminent contradictions of capitalism, liberal capitalism, would eventually bring about its destruction. There was nothing that the capitalists could do about this, because the only way to overcome these problems was for the society to cease being a liberal capitalist one, right? And what I think we should take away from all of these different observations is that the impasse of postmodernity that we find ourselves in isn't in some senses a break from liberalism or from some utopian time that existed before. It's a continuation of fundamental trends that existed within liberal democratic societies, such as the United States, from the very beginning. The consequences of the limitations of that society are now being experienced. And what we have to do is look towards a future where those limitations are overcome by doing away with elements of liberalism that were fundamentally unstable to begin with. Does that make sense?
Yeah, brilliant. I'm going to stop there. We're going to have to start on a new link. So I'm going to post you all in about 2 minutes a new Zoom link in Facebook, just because we have a time limit on here.
The various conservative approaches over time. We won't call them ideologies, because I think that becomes circular here, or embeds a conclusion at least. But given the continuity among those conservative ideologies, conservative approaches, excuse me, how do you clearly differentiate a conservative postmodern approach from a conservative modern approach, or pre-postmodern, whatever we want to designate that approach.
Sure. I mean, the big distinction is that it's important not to see postmodern conservatism as a break from the conservative tradition as a whole, but rather as a continuity, right? And the reason is, again, because various forms of conservatism were very amenable to the critique of universalistic reason and this distrust in grand narratives that are proffered by the postmodern condition, right? Where I think postmodern conservatism deviates from its earlier predecessors is that earlier conservatives did have a kind of authentic embeddedness in traditional forms of life and relatively static hierarchies that allowed them to normatively criticize universal reason from a different standpoint that was already well clarified and stable, if that makes sense. And to give an example, right, a Christian criticizing liberalism in the 19th century would have genuinely been embedded in an authentically Christian community where most of the people believed the same thing. That worldview is stable, the traditions associated, and entrenching it, were continuous over time. And there wasn't all that much reason to be anxious about whether this community and traditions would continue into the future, at least, within the short term. The difference between—
So to pause you for a second there, just to clarify for anyone listening, as well as myself, from a street view, this older conservative approach, this pre-postmodern approach, would be one in which if I were to question a priest, my question would be negated by the very fact that I, as a commoner, would be asking that of someone above me in the social, political, religious, economic hierarchy. De facto.
And whose status in the community and capacity to actually speak with some resonance wouldn't really have been questioned, right? Or at least not questioned to the same degree that you see within postmodernity. And this is one of the things, again, that distinguishes postmodern conservatism from its earlier king. And that's the kind of communities and traditionalism that earlier conservatives were able to draw upon to generate an authentic worldview that they felt integrally connected with have now disappeared because of the corrosive impact of neoliberal policies and the cultural conditions of postmodernity, which means that postmodern conservatives aren't able to speak from an authentic position. What they do is instead nostalgically generate this pastiche-like sense of what they think the past was like and what they think these stable identities were like in the past, and then assemble them as a way of agitating against what they consider to be a disordered status quo, right? And you see this with a lot of the postmodern conservatives who kind of assemble this mishmash of different sources of the self to construct their identity, right? One day they're a white nationalist, the next day they're a religious conservative, the next day—
Again, if I can just pause you for clarification once more, just so I fully and the audience understands where you're coming from. So this pastiche that's assembled as a reference to ground the cancellation of my truth by the conservative, okay? In a prior situation, a priest, again, to use that example, could have canceled my universalist stance or a rationalist stance to reason by the power given to them in the social hierarchy by being a priest, for instance. And that's authentic because it's grounded in this older fantasy of religion that we've agreed upon for so long. And this new pastiche that's assembled comes to us, it sounds like almost like branding, because today's, I'm thinking of maybe some technological groundings that lie behind this even, because like today's white supremacist is not yesterday, it's not your grandfather's white supremacist, and so your grandfather's white supremacist could always, in the US, and I remember this as a child, reference things that had happened that you thought happened, at least, in the South that were embedded in interpretations of books in the Bible, in the Protestant church in the South and things like that, and various textbooks that erroneously reported ideas of the Civil War. But now it seems to come from particular TV shows and particular memes and particular media personalities. And I think that's to some extent, and movies, the pastiche that you're referring to, which would be basically a new fantasy conservative. If I'm not trying to foist words upon you, but just thinking like the prior fantasy of religion, of Christianity or of Judaism, or I guess more appropriately Christianity, really for this tradition. That type of fantasy was used as a referent, and now it's a quicker, more easily assembled and disassembled pastiche, as you said, that comes to us through sounds like digital technology largely.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good way to put it, right? And there's this kind of consumer oriented mentality that people will sometimes take about their identity that you wouldn't necessarily see in a pre-postmodern epoch. And Mike's book actually has a lot of good stuff about this, so I strongly recommend people take a look at that. Can the left learn to meme? But put it this way, right? In the 19th century, if you were a religious conservative, odds are you lived in a conservative religious town, right? You probably had a good working knowledge of the Bible. You were literate. You had a deep understanding, of different religious texts, and you felt authentically connected to that identity. And the community as a whole supported that sense of identity. And so when you juxtapose yourself against the kind of corrosive effects of liberalism, you were doing so from a standpoint that had a little bit of authenticity and stability to it, right? What conservatives do now, people who have a kind of conservative outlook, is they don't have this kind of connection to a strong embedded community that reinforces their sense of identity. That's part of the problem. So to use your metaphor, they shop around for a sense of self. And the way that they usually do this is by turning to a nostalgic set of sources for their sense of selfhood, and then generate a narrative surrounding that. So they'll sit there and say, oh, who I am or who I should be is a white male. I should be a Christian. I should sit there and I should affiliate myself with Western civilization. But none of this is done in any kind of depth or with any kind of real integrity, precisely because of all the technological influences that you're talking about, right? They shop around, they find, a bunch of stuff online that tells them you should be this kind of identity, or this will provide you with a sense of meaning, and then they buy into that, right? And they're not really all that concerned with the authenticity of this, because they're not really all that concerned with how consistent the sources of the self they draw upon are. They just kind of pick and choose what seems interesting to them, mash it all together, and then say, this is who I am, and this is how I'm going to get a sense of meaning in the world. And what I need to do is get rid of all the leftists and egalitarians who are threatening this identity and the authority associated with it.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, I feel like I'm dominating this. Let me ask this last thing, and
yeah, go on then.
Like, what would allow, the previous conservative impulse would not be easily abandoned, because you'd have to tear apart the Catholic Church, for instance, and your relation to it, or tear apart the entire principality and the king and so forth. But this kind of conservatism seems like it's easily constructed and abandoned.
Oh, yeah. It absolutely is, right? I mean, look at somebody like Donald Trump as an emblematic figure in that respect, right? He started his career as a kind of weird liberal Democrat, if you want to call it that way, primarily because he pushed against social conservatism when that was advantageous to him. And then he adopted conservative principles when it was advantageous and when he thought it could get him elected, right? And a lot of his supporters tend to approach the world in a similar way, right? They have this visceral reaction to the instability that they associate with postmodernity. They tend to blame the political left or liberals for the sense of instability. They don't have authentic traditionalist communities that they can return to. So they go on the internet or they go on TV and they develop this nostalgic sense that in the past things were a lot better, when white men were in charge or when everybody believed the same thing. And then they kind of buy their sense of identity on the cheap from these sources, right? And the only thing that really stabilizes them or allows them to hold what are often some very conflicting sources of the self together is the sense that it's the left or liberals' fault that there's so much instability in the world. And so what we all need to do is react against them and try to rid our society of those who don't belong or those who are tearing down our most sacred and cherished institutions, right?
Okay. I'll let someone else.
Yeah, I would carry on with the question we have already prepared. So basically, this is the Acid Left podcast. So we have this kind of direction, or at least some kind of underlying principles which govern our output here and also on our YouTube channel. And we have a Patreon account as well. I guess we take a cue from Mark Fisher's Acid Communism, which is a term he came up with, and he was finishing, or actually he had begun a book called precisely Acid Communism when he passed away in 2017, and that introduction was published in a compendium. I think it was in late 2018 by the Peter books.
Book compilation.
Yeah. So there's some description there of what an acid communism may be, but kind of vague. So we're left with this term acid communism, which is very appealing, and it kind of sets off all these kind of ideas in one's head, but it's not really defined. And we decided to kind of take that up and called it the acid left, just so we were kind of even more open in our scope. And basically, we're also very skeptical of solid truths, as the postmodern thinkers were. We're also strongly influenced by Theodor Adorno and other Frankfurt School thinkers, which just kind of preceded postmodernism and were important kind of precursors in their disregard for the kind of risks of a rationality gone awry. So, rationality is very useful. In many respects, it's freed us, but then an over-rationality ends up categorizing humans and actually dominating them by using the very tools that they intended to kind of set them free. So we think there's much to be said for a politics which is kind of fluid and which doesn't have kind of very certain defined kind of characteristics, which is possibly why I don't personally want to use the word communism, because it gets associated very easily naturally with Stalinism. So I guess we're kind of like a communism, or the end game is something like communism, but we want to kind of achieve it without the gulag. So let me speak for myself at least on that. But in any case, I just want to ask you if you have any idea of how the left might reclaim that postmodern ground of non-truth. The right are doing very well with it, and I think the right are doing very well with it for one reason, and that's because they've also jettisoned ethics as such. So there's a kind of post-truthism without any kind of need to get back to kind of any ethical grounding, and the left has a problem matching that. Because we basically just trash our own project if we ditched ethics altogether. What's your solution to this conundrum? How does the left regain non-truthism?
Well, I think this is where we need to develop a modern critique of liberalism that draws on the tradition of people like Adorno or Marcuse or Slavoj Žižek today, and which is dialectically oriented. And the thing about dialectics is it doesn't insist that you embrace epistemic skepticism at the same time as you're highly critical of what one might call a standard liberal interpretation of what the truth is, as just a correlation between the world and the subject's thoughts about it, right? And the way that I cash this out politically is, look, like the reason that postmodernity has emerged is because liberalism has allowed a kind of radical subjectivism to inherit the earth, right? Where people feel alone, people feel isolated, and they feel that the only kind of truth that matters is how they feel about the world as in a kind of interior subject. And this is where you see some of the vulgarities of identity politics, particularly identity politics on the right, emerge from, right? And I think what we need as leftists to do is insist that truth comes from an encounter, a dialectical encounter with the other, right? and move away from the narcissism of subjectivism and recognize that it's through interacting with other people, learning from them, and engaging in authentic and loving relations with them that we can create truth for which we wish to live and die, right? And postmodern conservatism promises a false iteration of this by suggesting that we can have this kind of relationship with the other, but only the other that's like us, right? Only the other that is deracinated of all of its individuality or particularity or uniqueness, that's more or less a carbon copy of whoever it is that we are. And as progressives, what we need to insist on is that a dialectical encounter with the other is one that's radical, right? That teaches us, that forces us to question our own presuppositions, to escape our subjectivity and the excitement of encountering the new. And this can be, encountering people from foreign cultures. It can be encountering people who are experimenting with their gender in a way that we wouldn't have anticipated. It can come from encountering people who hold different religious and metaphysical views than us. The possibilities are endless. And that's something to be embraced and to be excited about, not something to look upon with fear and derision, like so many postmodern conservatives do.
For sure, yeah. Well, I certainly agree there. I'm just thinking tactically, how does the left kind of reclaim a disregard for truth, as it were? Terry, do you have any ideas, or perhaps Adam, on this?
That it is what we're talking about is more embracing that fluidity, but with what Matt was saying, maybe that recognition of the other isn't possible unless there's a basis, and that's where something like I think what Matt called millennium socialism kind of comes in, where we are understanding that this basic ground could be met, and then from on top of that you can actually embrace more of experimentation and more of losing yourself through experiencing the other, and that this rise in the postmodern conservatism and the post-truth amongst the right is a reaction to that, the fragility of our material conditions at the moment. The white nationalist or whatever doesn't necessarily come out of nowhere. They are scared of their material conditions while they are misplacing the blame on it.
Yeah, if I could just follow up, actually, I think something like this podcast is a really good idea, right? And the reason why this is a good idea is that you guys are presenting interesting and engaging left-wing perspectives that are respectful of difference and controversy, while at the same time encouraging people to think for themselves and to try to develop their own interpretation of what an encounter with otherness should look like, right? And I think that's something that the left hasn't been particularly good at in recent years. And one of the reasons why we haven't been particularly good at it in recent years is this easy temptation to see all of politics as about power rather than the encounter with the other. And if you see politics as exclusively about power, and you're oriented by an outlook that stresses subjectivism as the sole source of meaning, then the argument that you're going to make is that we need to seize control so that we can enact our own preferred way of looking at things. Doesn't matter what anyone else thinks, right? And I think this has been helpful in some respects, but it's ultimately proved counterproductive because it hasn't allowed the left to reach out to those who disagreed with us. And we really need to wean ourselves off of that tendency and start encouraging people to look at those who disagree with us as an opportunity to convince someone that they can change their mind rather than as a potential foe to be overcome, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you definitely touched on something there. Sorry, Terry, if I can just, because I had something to say. I think this thing when you say that the politics wants power, I think that's very important. And what we're trying to do here. Thank you for mentioning the podcast itself. I don't know how much the format of this podcast is really getting where we want. Apart from we're talking to really interesting people like Matt, like Elliot last time. But I think that politics, it's working along the lines of a kind of binary rationality, a kind of us and them rationality. And one way of breaking that down, which is a fundamental kind of fault in thinking, myself being a Dornian, I would say it's the kind of a fault of our tendency towards identity thinking, towards proceeding through life by identifying things under certain categories and therefore always kind of reducing them inadequately. And I think what the acid left aims at is a kind of abstraction of dialogue, such that we might not have any outcome or any rationally understandable message. You know, at some point, because I think the problem is too much control, basically, even by the what you call postmodern conservatives. I think something telling is that actually, whilst they're giving this thing of like chaos everywhere, putting out kind of contrary messages, they're still trying very hard to maintain control. And a lot of the things they're hanging on to are part of the old power structure. That being the problem, I think we need to somehow explode that with kind of deliberate nonsense or abstraction, which is what I'd like to get to with the acid left. I kind of made a meme yesterday, which was kind of pretty much nonsense. And I thought, well, that's interesting. You know, will people go along with memes that aren't very clear statements? Because memes are all very kind of identitarian in their way of categorizing. They're like this or that. It's very crystal clear. So anyway, yeah, breaking down the need for power and the need for intelligibility is something I'm fully up for somehow. But I think we've got a long way to go experimenting with that. Sorry, Terry, please come in.
Oh, it's interesting because I actually have an alternate path that, if I understand where Mike is coming from, that I think would work beside it, and that is the arts. You know, we really don't have anything approaching a leftist culture at this time. I qualify that because I think we're seeing one emerge. But you know, if you go back into the late 18th, especially the 19th century, you have all types of literature, the beginning of visual arts, but definitely a literature that talked to us about our everyday experiences and our encounters and conflicts with power, whether it's at work or with the church or whomever, you know, from Dickens and Hugo and Balzac, and all the rest. We don't have that now. And I see that very definitely if you go to bookstores and you see what literature is available to most people. Now, I'm purposely restricting it from people like us that seek out things. But most of the literature that's available to your average, whatever that would be, reader in the United States is actually very, very right-wing, very pro-military, occult, with this kind of background understanding of the church and how, you know, these forces tie in with those greater authorities. It's all along, and patriotism and things like that. You're now just seeing things like Parasite, you know, like movies and books with mass appeal that actually portray the lives of working people and a struggle against authorities. Again, we've had them before, but in the US, it seems we have a paucity of them now. And I think that kind of intelligibility of, you know, our daily lives is one way we could actually confront the other without an argument even, or argumentation, which to me, I appreciate it, of course, but it strikes me as very academically approachable, rather than approachable from the guy or gal who just wants to chill out in bed after stressing about the economy all day.
No, I mean, one of the examples I usually point to with my students is I actually think Rick and Morty is a really progressive show.
Yeah, exactly.
And the reason is, yeah, because it has a guy who possesses extraordinary abilities and he could use them to master the entire universe if he wants, which would be the kind of typical capitalist thing to do. But instead, he doesn't want to because his fundamental struggle is relating with the other. And in this case, you know, very directly relating with the other because he can't even get along with his own goddamn family, right?
Yeah.
He get along better with these aliens and weird, wacky people all around the globe, but he can't form a meaningful relation with his brother-in-law or his daughter or his grandson, whatever it happens to be. And the whole show is about how all power, intelligence, and resources in the world can't solve this problem for you. It needs to be a mediation that's undertaken in the absence of all those things, even if sometimes they can facilitate it. And I think it's a really clever expression of this, and it demonstrates a yearning on all of our part, since the show has become very popular, for communication and real engagement with other people, which is being denied to us under the conditions of postmodern late capitalism.
Right. Well, you know, just to insert one little addendum there to what you said is, you know, if you look at television 40 years ago in the U.S. With things like All in the Family, and I know people, it's a recent conversation with people here in New York, but other people have noticed it. You know, you have a character who is dragging out a lot of very ugly, racist, and sexist, homophobic tropes. And he's doing it on a screen in prime time, what they used to call it, and I guess still do, but in prime time. And you're actually having characters interact with him as at least some in the audience watching would interact. We don't have anything like that now, where you actually take, if you had a character that was an active supporter of some of the nonsense that comes from the White House these days, for instance, which is an obvious trope, and had that portrayed on a very realistic level with his relatives who hate him. And they have to get, you know, just like you're talking about Rick and Morty and things. We lack all of that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I can understand why it's difficult, right? Because it's all too easy to sometimes portray somebody who's reacting in a bad way to the conditions of late capitalism and to portray them as bad or malicious or evil, because that accords to our subjective and one-sided interpretation of the world. The more dialectical approach, which is to try to expose why this person holds the views they do, allowing you to understand them without necessarily agreeing with them, that's a much harder challenge to assume for art, right?
But art does that.
I think, you know, to come back to the Adornian point, why would the culture industry try to put something that's challenging like that up when it can just produce, you know, cheap one-dimensional trash, have that sell a lot more readily, and get out like robber barons, right?
Right. Right.
Okay, I just want to. I just need to let Adam come in because we're running short on time, and Adam was going to lead us with some questions on Matt's book, or the book which he co-wrote, Myth and Mayhem: A Leftist Critique of Jordan Peterson, which actually the co-writers were Dylan de Jong, Conrad Hamilton, Ben Burgess, and Marion Trejo. Is that right?
No, actually, so Ben Burgess, Conrad Hamilton, and Marion Trejo wrote the book Myth and Mayhem with us. Dylan and Eric and a few others, my friend David Holland, wrote the What is Postmodern Conservatism?
That's right, yes. Apologies, yes. Okay, so Adam, do you have anything to kind of get us into talking about Jordan Peterson?
Peterson, yeah, he's a fun topic. So I think what we've talked about here a lot without saying the words, which is something Peterson would harp on consistently, is the death of God concept popularized by Nietzsche, or put forward by Nietzsche. And I think Mike and I both agree that there is something to that strongly, and that the reason that so many people who maybe weren't right-leaning were attracted to Peterson was that longing for a genuine meaning. And, you know, we've discussed how it's kind of been brought back in this pastiche and this inauthentic identities and whatnot, yet that longing is there. And I wonder, you know, what your thoughts on that are, like, on pursuing that authentic meaning and the ways to go about doing that without getting caught in a reactionary trap such as Peterson tends to.
Look, I think that's exactly right. And there's been this long tendency going back to Marx, you could even argue going back to Rousseau, to pathologize any attraction to religion as a symptom of cultural conditions, particularly the cultural conditions of late capitalism. And in this sense, any kind of attraction to religion or anxiety about religious issues is inherently reactionary, it's ideologically driven, and it needs to be overcome by changing material conditions. Right? This is the kind of standard line, speaking very broadly. And I think that this is the wrong way to go. And I think it's the wrong way to go because people do have genuine religious concerns that, or spiritual concerns, if you want to use the more contemporary lingo, that warrant respect and warrant independent interrogation as psychological phenomena, right? That aren't just a symptom of a given cultural condition whose problems are going to be resolved by entering into some kind of higher form of political life. And as long as the left isn't actually dealing with these kinds of religious impulses, the right is going to. And it's always going to be able to attract a huge segment of people who have real religious concerns, since it's the only one that's dealing with these kind of matters, and the left just seems to ignore them, pathologize them, and often to do so in a really condescending way, right? By saying, oh, you believe in all that, that's just because you don't understand, that your problems are social and they'll be resolved that way, right? And I think we need to get past that, and there are a number of people who've done a pretty good job. Sadly, one of the people who I think actually did a fantastic job of talking about a left interpretation of spirituality was Michael Brooks, who again passed away recently. But we can look to like some of his influences, people like Cornel West, as exemplars of how you can marry spirituality or spiritual inclination with a left-wing politics. And I don't think it's all that hard, right? You can sit there and you can talk about how it is that if you're a genuinely spiritual person, you believe life has value, or you sense that there's some kind of intrinsic value to existence, that means that you should be concerned about creating a more just world, or one where all the beings that happen to exist have the opportunity to live meaningful, flourishing lives, right? Which is something that the right doesn't care that much about. And these are early days yet when it comes to kind of talking about some of these matters, but I think it's a big, big problem, and something we need to address a lot more carefully and with a great deal more sensitivity on the left.
Yeah, Brooks was even sympathetic to Jungian thought. I met him at the JP Con in Boise, Idaho, and he talked about James Hillman quite a bit, who wrote a book, I believe it was We've Had 100 Years of Psychoanalysis and Things Are Getting Worse. I haven't read James Hillman's work, but from the way he described it to me, it seemed very similar to some of the stuff that Fisher was working on and some of the stuff that like Eric Fromm worked on, with incorporating a more social and societal view with spiritual views. So yeah, I definitely think that that's an important way to look. But we also see on the left a dismissal of that, and a strong dismissal or refusal to take seriously some of the early strains of utopianism, like utopian socialism. Now, I do think Marx brought important critiques into there. But I do think that some of those earlier forms are worth looking at and re-examining and seeing how they could be brought into the 21st century.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And I think, again, there are definitely strands of left-wing thinking that we can look to talk about, progressive spiritualities. One of the ones that I'm personally interested in would actually be, Mike might like just, Adorno's relationship to Soren Kierkegaard, right? Because Adorno had a very up and down relationship to Kierkegaard and his kind of individualist spirituality. Usually this is interpreted as an exclusively critical take on Kierkegaard, but actually new research has shown that's a lot more nuanced than people appreciated. So that's one of the things that I'm doing kind of at a philosophical level. At a more down-to-earth level, strategic level, I think the kind of things that Brooks was doing, or Cornel West is doing, or even Slavoj Žižek is doing with this kind of materialist Christianity is really helpful, right? Talk to people about their religious concerns, address them seriously. Don't try to pathologize them as exclusively the consequence of, social conditions or politics, and try to provide answers that are meaningful to them and that resonate with them, not just politically and socially, but also individually, right? And how you can carry that out, I think, is a vast project that we need a whole other podcast to discuss. I'm optimistic that we're making some headway on this.
Yeah, I'd like to say to that, amen.
There you go.
Typical amen.
I
think I'm big into the idea that the left is lacking its spirit, as the right is, as society is. And actually, we have guests coming up that will be speaking about that. And we'd love to have you on again sometime to go into that, or indeed other areas.
Anytime, sure.